Hi all, this is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3, and in this particular video I really want to talk about achieving organizational goals and objectives. So this is actually part of my Nerd Out Wednesday series where I normally talk about things that are interesting in science, and I think that this actually does have a lot to say about science, and I'll get into it sort of going through the discussion of what I'm getting into. But first of all, what I'm going to do is go into and define, what are organizational goals and objectives, and then talk about, how do organizations normally achieve those goals and objectives, and then finally, get into what are some of the problems with sort of understanding this, and then, how does that relate to science? What am I actually talking about? So I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship. And, normally we talk about this stuff a fair bit within a, business environment. If you're going to business school, we would talk about, what are organizational goals and objectives. Well, they are really simply just kind of some sort of strategic directives or, some sort of statement detailing what the organization should do and what it should try to achieve. And normally this is sort of set by managers, and it's not just like senior level managers like the CEO, but it is a real mishmash of how they actually get set. So it could be like by a committee, for example. It could be by lower level managers, and they promote, they tell the sort of upper level managers on what to do, but it's kind of a mishmash on sort of what the goals and objectives are and how they're actually set. Then what this allows you to do, or what this normally does, it allows the organization to have a sort of outline of what expected behaviors are, and then you could judge performance relative to those behaviors. And then it also allows you to guide efforts and sort of action for going forward, right? So it gives managers an ability to sort of understand what they should do going forward. So how do we normally understand how organizations actually achieve these goals and objectives? So there is, many different sort of views of thought, but this is I think it's the most dominant view at this moment is using sort of behavioral theory to understand how organizations actually achieve the performance objectives, right? So imagine that an organization is this group of people and they're trying to achieve a particular performance objective. And then what they do is they do an action, they perform that action, see if that action actually achieves that performance objective that they're trying to get to. And if it does, then everything's great. They're not really going to do too much. They might do a little bit more, maybe they have extra resources to spend on other things. But in general, what they're going to do is only react when they actually don't achieve that objective that they're trying to do. So they set these goals, and then if they cannot achieve the particular objective or those particular goals, they say, I don't know what to do. Then what they do is they go and they start searching for solutions. They start looking for all these different problems. Or first of all, they look for where the problem exists and what's going on, and then they start looking for solutions to those particular problems. And then they obtain a particular solution, which is going to guide them in how they're actually going to achieve that particular action or do an action. Then they try to perform that action. They repeat that thing over again, right? So, for example, maybe it is in an organization that their marketing effort is not achieving what they wanted it to do. So they wanted to sell 1,000 units of something every single or the past year, and they realized they only sold about 500 units of that particular thing. So what they're going to do is they are going to think about, this is a problem. We only sold 500. We were expecting to sell 1,000. So then we have to sort of figure out, well, what's going on here? Well, maybe it was a marketing campaign that we did. Well, then we have to adjust that marketing campaign, or maybe scrap that marketing campaign and try something else. And then once they do that, then they see if they can reach that 1,000 unit limit or 1,000 unit sort of goal in the next year or the next quarter, right? So that's what they're trying to do repeatedly. So they have this performance objective, and then if they don't meet it, they try to move the organization in that direction to achieve that particular performance, that objective, right? That organizational goal. Now, there are all sorts of really interesting things here that are at play. that, research is still really unclear, but there's lots of things going on that, we kind of do know, right? So the first one is having a clear organizational goal. That's not always the case. It's really hard to sort of come up with a particular goal that an organization is going to achieve, right? So if you don't have a clear goal, then it's going to be hard to make these performance changes, make any sort of performance changes. The other thing is that with this sort of behavioral theory viewpoint, and this is kind of, I'm actively doing research on this area, is that assumes a really sort of short-term performance reaction that happens here, right? And that's not always the case. Sometimes I'm trying to, maybe a goal with research and development, for example, is you're trying to achieve something that's far out in the future, and you're not going to react to something in the short term. And you don't want to react to something in the short term, right? So sometimes performance falls in the short term, and you have to spend a lot of money, right? Because the research and development is costly and you want to achieve something in the future, right? So you have to, it's not always clear what it is, or whether, the other thing, it's, even if you know what these objectives are, we often don't clearly sort of specify them in any sort of clear way, right? So one thing might be, with selling 1,000 widgets, it's really sort of clear, but it might be the case that you're like, okay, I want to, maybe I am a not-for-profit, and I actually want to solve world hunger, right? Well, what is world hunger? That's a sliding scale. It's constantly changing. We know kind of what world hunger is, but it's not necessarily all that clear once you start digging down into it, right? So it might be that hunger is just this reaction that everybody gets, or it might be that, it's extreme poverty, where there's some people that are really, really poor that are hungry, right? And so which one are you trying to sort of achieve, and what are you trying to sort of get at, right? It's not necessarily clear, and people are going to have different discussions on what they should be trying to do, and it's just really not that clear in what they're trying to achieve. So the other thing that ends up happening too is that our objectives and goals and objectives of an organization can radically change throughout the organization sort of being around for a long time, right? So at one point, it's really clear that a performance objective, so meeting some sort of revenue per year, that is a really clear sort of performance objective, right? That most organizations need to achieve a certain revenue amount, but a lot of organizations do things just for simply survival, that they're trying to sort of do things just to stay around. So for example, it's clear when you start looking at an educational setting that a lot of schools, for example, do things just so that they stay within maybe that community, right? They don't want to be shut down. It's not necessarily a revenue goal, but they're trying to maintain this sort of survival in this area because they're providing an essential service, or lots of people perceive them as providing an essential service, right? They truly are in a lot of different ways. And you have to be sort of clear on that. And often these goals and these objectives are constantly changing within an organization. So what does that mean for science when you're trying to do something in a scientific way? So science is really interesting for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is the objectives that you're trying to achieve are often really far out in the future, right? So if you're trying to achieve, you're trying to create this particular idea, and this idea has implications, I don't know, you're not going to sort of understand what these implications are until you're maybe 25 years out. And that's a long time. That's a long time horizon to understand what these implications are, particularly if you start getting more radical ideas or different things that are not necessarily, so they're more on the basic science sort of things, where it's not necessarily all that clear what they're trying to achieve, right? What is the particular idea that they're trying to achieve? And if you're rewarding based on, or if you're creating a sort of scientific organization, maybe it's a university, maybe it's a research institute, for example, if you're creating an organization that is really focused on sort of short-term metrics, it is really going to be hard to understand what these things are, right? And we really struggle for people that are doing sort of scientific stuff. They understand the whole citation count, for example, is not really a good measure for a lot of different reasons of what performance what actually performance of a scientific process is, right? So for example, if you have a really strange, unusual idea that is really novel, but just amazing to a lot of different ways, well, it's often you can't put it within the sort of scientific community of where it situates, but people understand that this is an unusual idea that's kind of interesting, and it's over here, right? But so it might not get necessarily cited that much until it actually becomes useful and becomes part of the regular domain. And you see this happens a lot, particularly people that have a tremendous amount of forethought, and they see things maybe 20, 30 years out, so that scientific person might get underappreciated for years and years and years until it actually becomes part of the sort of general discussion that everybody else is doing. And that is kind of a normal thing that happens, right? If you're doing better science, you should be doing things that are more unusual, more novel, right? Different than what everybody else is doing. Because if you're doing exactly what everybody else is doing, that means you're not really sort of pushing the envelope. You're not really generating a tremendous amount of knowledge, right? You're just kind of repeating what everybody else is doing. So you have to push going forward. So this creates a giant mess, right, with achieving organizational goals and objectives, particularly within scientific organizations. Because if you don't really know what the goals are, if they're really ambiguous and they're far out in the future, well, how do you actually assess people's performance based on, how well they're doing, right? If you can't put your finger down what these objectives are, then you can't necessarily see if somebody's actually doing well relative to those objectives until maybe 30, 40 years out, and then you can assess what the performance is. But that's way too long, right? It'd be like myself, with my own performance, you can find out how well I did when I'm 70 or when I'm 80, right? In terms of the scientific process that somebody does, right? So I'm in my 30s now. That's far too long to assess performance in any sort of way, in any sort of meaningful way. So how do you actually get to understanding how do you actually sort of navigate some of these problems, these messy problems within science, and achieving what they're doing, right? And to have a better sense of measuring performance or getting the sense of what the organization's goals are, measuring the performance relative to these particular goals. Well, I think to mitigate some of these issues, what you have to have is a tremendous amount of organizational slack within sort of scientific organizations. So giving people a lot of time as well as resources to achieve the things that they're doing, which is often not the case, right? We expect people to do really novel, interesting ideas, and then we think that it should be done immediately. Well, it just doesn't happen. That is not the way that things are actually done. Normally that there is a tremendous amount of outlay at the beginning. Any sort of investment, there's a huge outlay at the beginning, and then it just takes a long time to actually get there. Pharmaceuticals is a perfect example of this. You might have this huge outlay at the beginning, and it's going to be 10 years, so sort of on average is roughly about 10 years before a pharmaceutical actually gets onto the marketplace and starts recouping the costs or generating enough revenue to recoup the costs that you actually spent on that. And that is really tricky, right? That's often far out in advance for most people. So another thing that you can do is actually try to, rather than measuring on performance per se, but try to measure on observable metrics, right? Rather than looking at particular outcomes. So paper publications, that's a terrible sort of outcome to measure. What you should be actually, because you don't know whether somebody's actually going to cite until you're like maybe 30, 40 years out. And even then, you still don't know whether people are going to cite those papers until it's maybe 100 years out. And then even then, it might be important in 1,000 years. You just don't know. So it's really kind of poor metrics, I think, to sort of look at measuring performance based on papers, right, or citation counts and things like that. But rather what you should be looking at is observable metrics. And this might be, is this person or whatever you're looking at, are they coming in on a regular basis? Are they trying to write on a regular basis? Are they being sort of part of a community on a regular basis? Are they trying to contribute to different ways? Those things are ways that you can actually measure it and get down to the nitty gritty. Or for example, if you have an organization that's doing sales, and you're just not getting sales for a long time because maybe it's the external environment, right? There's stuff going on in the external environment. It's 2008, for example, and the financial crisis happened. You might not get a lot of sales, but what you can do, instead of measuring the sales that you're getting and basing performance on the sales, you measure based on the number of visits that the salesperson has made to different organizations, right? And that's going to give you a better performance measure. Maybe if they're visiting 1,000 different organizations in a year, then you know that they're actually performing, right? That they're performing at a level that they should be relative to what everything else is. But there's just this kind of external environment. There's just messy stuff that's happening outside of the organization. The other thing that you should do is, reward the sort of decisions that are sort of decisions that are moving you in the right direction. In the sense that the decisions or the outcomes that you're getting at are really probabilistic, right? So somebody might actually do all the right things. They might perform all the right particular actions, but they're not going to get there because there's craziness that are happening, right? That it's really difficult to sort of get to that particular thing. So you should be looking at the behaviors that's getting you to sort of more better decisions, or looking at the decisions that are given the information that they have, that this is the right thing that they should have done. Or, given that particular situation, that's the right thing that they should have done, rather than looking at these sort of objective outcome of something, right? So looking at did that particular organization actually achieve the $5 million sale from a particular university? Well, if they didn't achieve that $5 million sale, then you don't want to say, this salesperson this person is garbage. Well, that was a really big contract. That was really hard to get. Now, did they do all of the right things to actually try to get that particular contract? Did they write up the tender? Did they do it properly, right? Did they write up the contract properly? Did they actually get to the point where, people were interested, but it just fell through at the last minute? Well, that's what you should reward, rather than did you actually achieve that particular outcome, right? Like that's the closer thing that you should be doing, and that's what organizations should be doing in terms of achieving the organizational goals and objectives, is thinking clearly about not the particular outcome, right? Not did they achieve that particular outcome, but did people perform the intended actions? Did they try to actually get to that particular outcome, but that there is something else that happened along the way to get to that particular outcome? And this has really important implications in terms of understanding how people get rewarded in science, how people might get rewarded in a sales organization, how research and development might actually progress in an organization. There's lots of different things that you can sort of look at where there's a messiness that happens. It's not clear-cut. The only time that is really clear-cut with these organizational goals and objectives, and then trying to achieve those goals and objectives, is when you're doing things that are really fairly simple, that there is a reward almost instantaneously of you actually performing that particular action. And there's very few organizations or very few tasks that actually have that reward structure. It's actually more of the ordinary that you do a particular action and you invest a lot of time and then you wait for that particular outcome. That's more along the lines that happens. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. I know that this was a kind of a ramble, but at the same time, I think it's a really important concept to think about in science. It's an important concept to think about in general in terms of understanding people's performance and understanding the organization's performance and what they should do. So that's it. Take care. And by the way, if you like the Nerd Out Wednesday series, I put out every Wednesday about things that I find interesting in science, and talk about them, and as well as to subscribe to the YouTube channel and give me a thumbs up. All right, take care. Bye.